Hi everyone, and welcome to the World of Work podcast. This podcast is a topic spotlight series and brought to you by Autism Valued Incorporated, previously known as Asperger's Victoria, and in relation to our World of Work initiatives. My name is Jacob Allen, and I lead all things employment related for the AV community, and I do this work with lived experience as my backbone. With my own diagnosis of autism, ADHD, and Tourette syndrome. We are a small non-profit doing big work, and this podcast is simply a means of trying to let more people know who we are and what we do. I hope you enjoy what we have to say. Let's get into it. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the World of Work podcast. Joining me today is Xavier Gunn, and I've invited Xavier in today to speak to the topic of the hidden cost of fitting in at work. Welcome, Xavier. Before we kick in, could I just get you to introduce yourself and a little bit more about the work you do?
Thanks, Jacob. So I'm excited to be on this podcast. With respect to the work I do, to summarise my career, I had a career working in data science, in consulting, and for financial services companies. And I found that really rewarding. And part of what I did in those roles was driving initiatives to create a more inclusive workplace for other autistic people. I was diagnosed with autism as a kid, and I've always wanted many other autistic people to feel included at work and to have opportunities as well. I left the corporate world to work at an AI health startup where I'm a founding data scientist. And my role there largely revolves around working on the core AI capabilities, improving our AI risk management, and also better understanding our users. Naturally, in that environment, a lot of our users, I should say, work with autistic people and neurodivergent people. So I'm very grateful that the work that I'm doing now in trying to create new technological capabilities directly links to my own values and endeavours in life to help autistic people more broadly in society.
Yeah, brilliant. And I would just highlight, um, you know, we met through that previous corporate role, and I just want to mention that you were still an advocate in that role, and in yeah, ever since I've known you, you've always been a great supporter and great advocate, and a really yeah.
Yeah, we met when I was working at a bank organising internships for neurodivergent high school teenagers to go and work there for a week and see what the world of work was like. And of course, that's an active interest of yours, part of why you're the host for this podcast. So it's great that we've been able to work together over time towards our shared goals.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we just reflected on coming into this podcast that we've known each other now for almost 3 years. So,
Mm.
yeah, really cool to have you in here today, not only as my guest, but as my friend. So, for the listeners at home, I just want to run through a little bit about the way we're going to present the flow of this conversation. Um, as the host, I don't try and I don't want my voice to be the main voice. I brought you in here to hear your perspectives and your lived experience. So for those at home, I've just got a set of questions that I'm going to use as a bit of a prompt to guide today's conversation. And uh, himself has brought in a couple of questions and comments and things that we hope we can leave you with today. So without further ado, I'll jump into question one, which is why do you think it can be so challenging to fit in at work?
There are multiple reasons. Now, when it comes to thinking specifically of autistic people in the workplace, I think that the challenge largely stems from the environment. And that's an environment where, through mechanisms both understood and not fully understood. The vast majority of the population being non-autistic people as different in some ways create the social norms and expectations of that environment. I don't think that many non-autistic people, I think many non-autistic people are inclusive of autistic people, at least in principle. They want autistic people to be included. However, it's more difficult in practice than theory to create an environment that is inclusive of people you may not understand or be very familiar with or work with on a regular basis. For the most part, I think the environment, if it's not inclusive of autistic people, it's not intentional. It's um, the unintentional effect of the majority um, creating an environment that is most suited to themselves. I think the environment is what makes it difficult. Now, autistic people will come into that environment and they may be the only person who is openly autistic there because I think I came across a study in Scotland that around 75% of autistic people do not disclose in the workplace, and they are approximately 1 to 2% of the population. So they may be the only one there who has an inherently different way of thinking and perhaps their own set of needs or differences, and then the onus is on that individual to not only comprehend the environment that they work in and how to best operate in that environment and adapt, but also to communicate what their needs are to all of their colleagues. So the onus on understanding differences and the onus to communicate their own needs is put on the same individual. So I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding out there that when we talk about the cost of fitting in at work, it's about adapting to the workplace. But I would argue that even if an autistic person can perfectly adapt to that workplace and still be extremely confident, even theoretically the most competent person in that entire workplace, there is still a potentially a hidden cost. And that cost is in trying to adapt to an environment that adapt to the they may find themselves adapting to the people around them rather than being an authentic version of themselves. And that's a practice often called masking. Okay, where autistic people try and come across as less autistic to meet the expectations of those around them. And I came across a literature review that found that autistic people who mask a lot experience higher instances of anxiety and distress and depression. So I think there's a bit of a misconception that the autistic people who face the most challenges in adapting to society are going to suffer the most when that's not really the case, because those who are very good at adapting to society in that process of not being authentic to themselves potentially carry the additional burden of that inauthenticity. And in doing so, they find themselves having to hide who they are for fear of the consequences for decades of their working life, just to be perceived as competent. And then how may their colleagues around them perceive them, even if they do disclose they are autistic? They may think that individual has is a inspiring example of someone who has overcome the challenges of being autistic, when the reality is the exact opposite. In conforming to others' expectations, they haven't overcome the challenges of being autistic. They've only exacerbated with them to to fit into a non-inclusive environment.
Yes, no, I agree, and quite often the you know added cost would be at home when you're trying to recover from that, and you take off the mask, and um, you know you don't want to say became, you release your autism, but yeah, when I think of things like stimming and even with myself with the Tourette's, trying to hold that back sometimes, there's extra things that happen at home, extra routines and stuff to reprime yourself to kind of unload from the day. Um,
That's exactly right. If we think about stimming, to give the audience a specific example of what I'm talking about, stimming repetitive movements can be a way for many autistic people to relieve stress, but it's actually seen as a symptom of more severe cases of autism. So, paradoxically, engaging in what is best for you as an individual can make you be perceived as more limited or challenged. So people find themselves in this situation where they're trying to understand, do I do what's right for me, or do I do what other people expect of me?
mm, Quite often, unfortunately, we do the what other people expect of us, don't we? So,
Mm.
what would you say the benefits of disclosure are, and what makes it so hard to do so? Do you think?
I was looking through some literature reviews before this meeting, and many autistic people who disclose do report other people bullying them or discriminating against them. Now, in Australia in 2017, the advocacy and research organisation called Amaze did a survey, and approximately 10% of Australians report they would be concerned if an autistic person was their colleague, and approximately 20% report they would be concerned if an autistic person was their boss. Furthermore, a significant proportion of people reported that they didn't think it was possible for an autistic person to engage or hold certain jobs, such as a waiter. So if you're coming up against those sorts of misconceptions, it can make it that much harder to disclose. So I think that's the challenge, the risk of discrimination. Now the benefits are, firstly, of course, it can enable an autistic person to receive reasonable accommodations which are of both benefit to the individual and the employer. I say the employer because accommodations can help someone be a more productive version of themselves, which is, of course, what workplaces want from people. And of course, it can be of benefit to the individual because they are more set up to succeed. That's the more practical consideration. In addition to that, if someone doesn't feel like they have to hide who they are for fear of the consequences, then that can reduce a lot of stress and burden when it comes to the mental effort that they put into portraying a different version of themselves to meet the expectations of others. And if they don't need to do that, if they're not putting, for example, 30% of their mental energy into appearing a certain way, that means they can put 30% of their energy into helping other people in the workplace or being more productive in their own work. So I would argue that that's also of benefit to the employer. And then there's a more subtle benefit, which is if an autistic person feels like, and I've experienced myself, that they can be open to who they are, then that reminds you that you live in a society where your own experience and differences are considered part of the human experience and part of that society rather than something to hide that is not welcome, because we as humans feel inherently attached to our own way of thinking and perspective. So, if that can be considered part of the constellation of human experience rather than something to deliberately ignore, then it makes us feel more included in the societies we live in.
Great response. One of the things you made me reflect on there, when you're talking about the the study and the reflections of people being concerned about having an autistic, leader.
Mm.
Um, Before I, well, I, at AV, I lead other other autistics and other neurodiverse people. But before I got into this role, I myself worked in sort of a corporate bakery setting and leadership, and that was my thing. And I actually think, although I didn't disclose that, it was probably a large part of, what made me pretty good at what I did. So, um, but then when I've, become more of a leader, or to have to think with more efficient processes, one of the things I also sort of reflect on in that sense is I actually think that it's the opposite of that, where if we think about a lot of people who are, managers or CEOs and stuff, there's then elements like getting a personal assistant and having other team members who can take off the burden. You're kind of applying the 80/20 rule when the higher you become, you have to be focused on that core thing that you're best at, that um, you know making sure it's all efficient. And a lot of that is really quite supportive. So it wasn't until later on in life that now I have a programs coordinator for what I do. um, it might have assistants or second in charges, as I grew in my career. And that actually allowed me to sort of thrive a bit, because then we could lean on each other's strengths. And I guess that study kind of comes about how, so that's reflected in the literature through body doubling, and how just having someone, to body double can help a lot of people with neurodiversity. But um, yeah, I feel like that study and that perspective that people take, um, it's quite upsetting when I feel if under a different light, it could be quite different.
If I may add to that, I think what you're getting at is how we're all different, and those differences, the different strengths, can compound synergistically in the right environment, but we can also make up for each other's weaknesses by working together. Well, when I talk about non-autistic people, I don't think non-autistic people are better or worse than autistic people. I just think we're different. So the better we can uh, ca- assist other people where they're having difficulty and enable them to use their strengths, then the more effective we can be collectively. If I may briefly touch on strengths, I think I think there are a couple of strengths that I've seen repeatedly with autistic people. The first one is around honesty and direct communication, which is, of course, quite a common one for people to talk about. Now, I've noticed that some academics refer to this as stemming from black and white, what they describe as black and white thinking, which can sound quite negative on the surface. But I would argue instead that any ideas well understood can be conveyed simply and directly. And if you're not able to do that, then you don't really understand the idea. Therefore, trying to understand ideas concretely does not limit your ability for abstraction. Instead, it enhances your ability to add clarity to a situation. And I saw this a lot when I was working as a consultant, where we would work with many different organizations. And because they were helping them with different tasks, and because they were so involved in the politics and the weeds of their own workplace, it was hard for them to take a step back and to think about it more objectively and ask the difficult and direct questions in order to better understand what was going on and what could be done to improve a situation. Now, I've seen that same capacity in the workplace from multiple autistic people where they may raise the concern or make the observation that there's not very good role clarity in a team, for example. So, I just talked about the benefit of direct communication and how that can stem from trying to understand the world in more concrete terms. I think the second benefit that I see repeatedly is focusing on details. Now, the challenge with I think focusing on details can sometimes be misinterpreted as not seeing the bigger picture or thinking more holistically how things can be done differently. And I see a lot of, obviously everyone's different. There are non-autistic people who are great at this too, but I see a lot of autistic people really excel at inductive thinking, where they look at specific details and understand that situation to build up to a broader conclusion, which informs how they can perceive and understand the world. And that's quite a different process to deductive reasoning that I see among many non autistic people, where they'll take an existing idea and try and apply that to a situational situation using, I guess, known ways of thinking and understanding the world, and the art of applying that is great, but so is, um, but it doesn't really lend itself as much to understanding what best to do in new or unfamiliar situations. And that's where I think inductive thinking is really important. An example of an autistic person who's used inductive thinking to create innovation is Temple Grandin, where she is incredibly good. She's an animal psychologist who is incredibly good at understanding how cows think and the environment around it, and how even small reflections of light or noises can affect them. And then she took that empathy, she took an understanding of those details, and has designed completely new systems that are used in the livestock industry. So she was able to create systems more holistically met the needs of the industry and the animals from the details, instead of taking an existing approach and trying to apply it to solve a problem.
Yeah, it's really good. Thank you. And I think that leads itself really nicely into my next question, which is what can individuals or organizations do to make disclosure safer and fitting in less exhausting?
That's a really big and difficult question. So, most organizations don't have any programs or policies to try to make that organization more inclusive of autistic people. But I don't think that's necessarily the most important thing. Formal policies and procedures and strategies and processes can be um, can be helpful, but they don't really make up for an organization that doesn't have an inclusive culture. I remember when I was working at a large bank, the CEO there said that they believe inclusivity is a mindset, and that's what I ultimately think it comes down to. I've seen some people think that in order to create an inclusive environment for autistic people, what they need to do is essentially become an expert on autism, read books on it, figure out exactly what that autistic person needs, create an environment that aligns with everything that person needs. But I'd argue that's not necessarily going to be helpful either, because many autistic people are different and have different needs. And if you're just applying theory, deductive thinking, in order to understand what an individual needs purely based on a diagnosis, then you're not really accepting the individual or listening to them. What I've observed is many of the most inclusive environments, in many of the most inclusive environments, the leaders there may have a very limited theoretical understanding of autism, but what they do have is the ability to listen to the individual, care about the individual, and try and understand what the individual's saying to them in order to help create a better environment around them. It's about having the mindset of learning from others' differences rather than trying to prescribe what they need.
No, it's a brilliant point.
Yeah, so I do believe that inclusivity is ultimately a mindset. Yeah, I've seen people with psychology degrees who have a strong theoretical understanding of autism be the bosses of autistic people and be terrible bosses because they're too caught up in telling them what they think they should do, or perhaps their own idiosyncrasies are not very inclusive. But I've also, of course, seen bosses who have never read a single article on autism in their life, but regardless of who is working for them, they'll try and understand them and create a positive environment. And it's that mindset that ultimately results in that.
Yep, I agree with that, and I feel like I'm probably more of the latter because having no, academic background for what I do, it all comes from that sort of grassroots, um, lived experience and first principle thinking approach. So,
I
um,
think I think that learning about autism theoretically is useful so far as it can sometimes allow you to empathize with autistic people, but I disagree with the idea that it is useful in helping you understand what specific actions to take to accommodate an individual because that depends on the individual.
yeah, absolutely. And thinking about your temporal ground and uh, you know uh, example there, feel like it sort of comes down to first principle thinking, and I know I've sort of said this in part in different settings where a lot of the environmental changes that within a workplace that would be quite supportive to our community, they're they're not they're human like factor changes. So I
Mm.
find when we talk about like some stereotypical ones like you know fluorescent lights and artificial lights. Well, for every human, being outside in the sun in natural light is naturally better. It's not good for any of us to be under that spotlight, so to speak. And quite often, yeah, I think if we realize that a large part of the autistic condition is that we're just hypersensitive and hyper aware to those sort of things sometimes. So we might be the ones who point it out, but yeah, I think you'd see huge changes um, in workplaces if you started to do things with just that first principle approach of what goes back to what's best for the human condition, not the workforce.
That's
Or
exactly right. I often see people make comments to the effect of, well, all autistic symptoms are can be whether it be a desire for direct communication or being bothered by loud sights or sound can in some way all of those in some ways can be related to by the average person, but that also means that if we can create an environment that uh, does not exacerbate those challenges for autistic people, then the overlapping challenges or the addressing of those overlapping challenges with the broader population, even if they're not quite as pronounced, can benefit everyone.
yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good segue into my final question, which is um, more leaning from your personal experiences, which is what's been different, if anything, in spaces where you felt like you didn't have to hide.
In every single workplace I've worked in, I have disclosed, but how much autism I show in those workplaces depends on how inclusive I understand the environment to be. Now, even in the least inclusive workplaces I've worked in, people have been inclusive of me for being autistic, at least in the abstract. But when I might ask for something small that they might help with something small that they might not think I need help with, they might not respond very well to that. They may perceive me as someone who's overcome many challenges and see me like every other colleague instead of someone with a diverse set of strengths and weaknesses. Now, you could argue that's kind of my fault because I've put a lot of effort into um, trying to align more with corporate expectations. But at the same time, I'd really appreciate it if, in some cases where I deviated from that, it was well received too. For example, someone might say, "Oh, yes, I'm very inclusive of you for being autistic, Xavier," but then if I point out what everyone's thinking that no one else is brave enough to say in a situation, they might not respond very well. But hang on, being, in my view, being inclusive of autistic people means also being accepting of directness. So there's a conflict there. There's an inconsistency. Every workplace I've worked at, for the most part, people have been accepting in principle, but how authentic I can be and how much I can show of myself really depends on the circumstances and the people who I'm working with. In my current job at a startup, I've noticed that there's a very casual, accepting culture where people don't necessarily put much pressure on you to act or portray a certain way. They're very, it's very results driven. Instead
Mm.
of wearing a suit on a regular basis, I'll often wear a t-shirt to work. Um, and a lot of people there are sort of just really passionate about what they're doing, and that's the shared culture, not so much how you portray yourself as an individual, and are working really hard to achieve results. And I find that to be an inclusive environment. What I don't find to be an inclusive environment is some workplaces or teams where people feel like they can't say what they think, and they put more effort into saying the right things to the right people and playing politics instead of focusing on what they believe themselves will make the biggest impact to their work. I don't think that's a very inclusive environment for autistic people, but I don't think it's a very inclusive environment for anyone, to be honest, and it doesn't lend itself to the success of the team. Instead, it lends itself to people focusing most on what they think will make themselves look good as an individual, regardless of whether or not that negatively affects anyone else. So I'm quite grateful for my colleagues at the startup. You know, I can say ridiculous stuff, just make crazy jokes, and people don't hold it against me. And instead, they care about what they work, which should be given in most workplaces, but I don't think it is.
In saying that, I did also realize the way I introduced this conversation, I didn't highlight that you are actually a volunteer and supporter of the AV community, and also our Touchstone series facilitator. So I wanted to bring that up now, just because the purpose of this podcast is to kind of feed back into some of the work and the advocacy and the stuff we do in the background. So I just wanted to highlight that not only a friend, you're a friend of mine and a friend of community. You're a volunteer. Everything whether it's your work, your volunteer work, everything you're doing is um, yeah, it's deeply aligned. So
Hmm.
um, thank you for all the stuff you do to help me with that.
Well,
Now,
I really enjoy being part of this touchstone meetings where we talk about um, topics such as these with different people, and I also like to hear from their perspectives. So it's been quite a fun, rewarding experience for me.
yeah, brilliant. Well, we've got another year of them coming ahead of us, so plenty more fun to come about. Now, for the listeners, I've been asking my recent guests to bring in a little bit of, um, just stuff that they feel is important. So, whether it's a set of questions, in Xavier's case, I believe it's one question, one comment, and sort of a statement. But that question is not only directed to me; it's directed for a bit of reflection for community at large. And yeah, we hope that with this content that we give you some stuff to take away and think about. So, Xavier, did you want to jump in and Yeah, ask me a question or ask the question to community.
Sure. So, my first question is it the responsibility of autistic people or the workplace itself to create an autistic environment to create an inclusive environment for autistic people? Is that the responsibility of either autistic people themselves in the workplace or the workplace itself?
That's a really good question. Um, Look, I think it comes down to, you know, ownership of self as well as, yes, it's of course the workplaces, um, need, but then there is that sort of, um, you know, kind of that line where workplaces are there to, they have their operations, they they have their processes, they have things, and all of them are apparent up front. So there's part of it where I think, if you're going into that organization and you feel like that they're not inclusive enough, a little bit of that is coming from your lack of due diligence to make sure that they're a right fit for yourself as well. Um, but at the same time, you know, uh, as it's becoming more of a universally, with the whole diversity and inclusion movement, it's becoming something that's being put onto the workplaces themselves more directly. But the exciting thing about that is it also opens up new opportunities for those autistics within that workplace to then, utilize their voice to create, internal networks and sort of lead some of those conversations to make sure, you know, um, that they're aligned and utilizing our strength of, social justice and that sort of thing, to to ensure that the work that workplace puts in, yeah, in place is actually working for community. Because quite often I find in a lot of the efforts of workplaces, like a lot of the efforts that they take trying to make inclusive programs, kind of in way they by going for inclusion, they kind of exclude, like there's an excluding factor of that whole
Mm.
inclusion element. Because if it's done in the wrong way, where you go, okay, we've got, this program, or we've got this employment, way we do our employment, like our interviews, or if there's all these special treatments
Mm.
and things that are built for our community, then that doesn't make us feel like we're part of, you know, the organization at large. That's where I think it should be
You
more of that
raise a good
universal.
point there. So earlier I was talking about how bosses should not necessarily, or managers or employees, whatever you want to call them, should not necessarily do a bit of research on autism and then presume that they know better than an individual what their needs are. Well, with the exception of certain workplaces that are specifically set up for high needs
Mm,
individuals, that then creates a greater responsibility of those autistic people to communicate what those needs are. And it's very difficult for me, or even if I'm autistic or anyone else, to understand what someone needs if they're not communicating to me what those needs are. So, in my opinion, it's a shared responsibility both of the workplace and of the person to communicate what their needs are. And I think it's the responsibility of the workplace not just to accommodate or listen to autistic people, but anyone, regardless of who they are autistic, in order to best set them up for um, success. I think I've faced a little bit of feedback from people in the past who get the impression that I'm too focused on what autistic people need or want without thinking about everyone else. But I don't feel like that's my stance. I think that autistic people can also play a role in understanding those who are different to them, because if it's the responsibility of the workplace to try and understand different people and autistic people are part of that workplace, then that empathy towards those who are different to themselves is also the responsibility of autistic people, even if it's for reasons completely different to autism. And I think that autistic people can often be quite good at that because through the experience of adapting to a world not designed for them, where understanding those who are different to them, the vast majority of the population who are non autistic, is a prerequisite to participating in society. That experience fosters a willingness and a capability to understand uh, or at least try to be accommodating and listen to those who may have a difference of opinion, come from a different culture, have a different way of working, whatever the case may be. I don't think inclusivity and understanding others is around recognizing familiar cues. Instead, it's being open to unfamiliar differences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where, we'll really see that sort of level up in a lot of organizations where it's probably not I don't know if it's a bit of an example way to sort of word this, but if we look at the sort of neurotypical versus neurodiverse mindsets, it can kind of we can kind of lean on that whole left brain, right brain theory that we often heard
Mm,
growing up. But where we know we have the capability to, engage and connect with both parts of uh, both hemispheres of our brain
mhm.
in some way. If you look at that, where that should be the goal within their systems is how do we make you know just like our neural networks, how do we make our workplace networks work in such a synergy that we can unlock that full brain approach when we're tackling things. And um yeah, I just think when we do that, when it's not when it is just one whole
Mm.
um one workplace that is doing it right. And there are some
Yeah, I
few
think I think
examples.
autistic people can help create the environment. It's not just about the workplace understanding autistic people. It's also about autistic people as part of that workplace trying to understand others. And that leads into my next comment that fitting in at work is not just about your colleagues being accepting. It is also about being the sort of person colleagues should accept. Now, I'll make a comment that might sound a bit provocative if taken out of context. So I hope no one sort of takes this out of context. But I don't believe that um, workplaces should be inclusive of everyone because I'll give a specific example. If an individual, regardless of whether or not they're autistic, is, let's say, rude to other people or a bully, for example, I don't think workplaces should be accepting of that. So, one of my main pieces of advice for autistic people to be included in the workplace is to treat other people with the same level of inclusivity that you expected to be treated with. If you treat other people with respect, they're more likely to treat you with respect. Now, that might be a given to some autistic people, but I have come across a minority who are very focused on how other people treat them, but could also treat other people better. And in my view, that's not okay. And that could that minority of people could unfairly portray autistic people in the workplace in a negative light just because you still have a level of responsibility to reciprocate the respect you expect to be treated with.
Mm. Yeah, I think that mirrors to my comment earlier about how it's our responsibility within the workplace, just as it is the workplace's responsibility. Uh, all of these conversations, just like life, it's kind of two sides to the one coin. And um, yeah, we need to start just by with ourselves. That's the famous Michael Jackson quote: "Start with the man in the mirror," kind of thing. So
So, when it comes to disclosure of autism in the workplace, of course, there's potential benefits and risks. Now, I'm not going to tell people whether or not they should disclose because every context and environment is different. You know the culture and environment of your workplace better than me, so I can't tell you um, to disclose or not disclose, but I do want to give the audience something to consider. Now, of course, there's the risk of discrimination, but I think that it's also worth taking into account that disclosure, a benefit of disclosure is that authenticity can build allies. And in my view, allies are more important to your career than enemies because not everyone is going to like you, no matter who you are. If someone has a neutral attitude towards you, they're not going to promote you or hire you. But if someone loves you, then they're more like, and thinks you're awesome at your work, then they're more likely to promote you or hire you. And sure, some people might judge you for being autistic, but the thing is, everyone has people who judge them and don't like them anyway. So I think if you're going to operate in the world, which is not necessarily fair, then you need to have some tolerance for people not liking you and judging you. And that shouldn't, and the fear of that should not stop you from living a life where you are authentic to who you are. Now, of course, the reality is we do live in a world. I think you'll remember, Jacob, I was talking to a group of high school students at ANZ Bank where I'd organised an internship for autistic high school students, and I told them that I didn't really care if they wanted to work at a bank because, in my opinion, the benefit of the program was to see that there are workplaces out there where people will try to be inclusive of autistic people, and I didn't really have evidence of that as a teenager. And I see lots of autistic people who are scared of discrimination in the workplace, and that is a real risk because that does occur on a regular basis. And I told them that they may very well experience that discrimination in their life as much as I dislike that. But at the same time, I do believe that if they move forward with courage rather than fear, even if they encounter challenges along the way, then they have every right to believe that they can find a workplace where they are included, valued, and can be proud of who they are. Now, I only have one life. I would much rather take the risk of being authentic than trying to reduce the risk of people not liking me because I find it hard to imagine anyone who has lived a fulfilling or successful life who has placed a higher priority on not accepting people than being the best version of themselves. And perhaps the only thing that supersedes the human capacity for prejudice and cruelty is that of kindness.
And I don't know how to follow on from that because that's a very
And it's been beneficial to me because I've now left the corporate world and I work with a awesome group of people are dedicating who have dedicated much of their life or are dedicating their current work to helping people with disability. So that's part of where authenticity has led to me. So although it might have been a bumpy road and not everyone has had positive attitudes towards me, I'm ultimately grateful for where I have come, and that's part of the trajectory of my life. But I also feel incredibly grateful that it's turned out that way because not everyone is so lucky, and I need to be mindful of myself that although I have experienced some challenges, things have worked out more positively than me for other people. So part of why I disclose and do this sort of advocacy work is not to further my own goals, but instead to help other people have some of the opportunities that I've had.
yeah.
I don't like the idea of other people judging me for being autistic more than anyone else, but I don't think anyone should have to experience that. And I'm lucky enough that I'm at a point now where my own professional reputation supersedes any specific negative perception that someone may have about autistic people. Not everyone is that lucky. So I think having that privilege, there's a responsibility on me to, instead of hiding in the shadows, to live with the discomfort of people potentially judging me to help other people.
I think that is a perfect, you know, uh, segue to probably close this conversation, because that's exactly how I feel when doing this podcast.
Mm.
It's these things are they're awkward to do, sitting here in front of cameras and microphones and so forth. But yeah, I often I feel the same way. If I have to be the one who fails forward and puts themselves, out there and um, get judged and so forth, so that the community can be better understood, I'm more than happy to do that. Um, so yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. And yeah, I hope our conversation today has given a lot to reflect on. Um, and yeah, please do, yeah, keep an eye out for more of Xavier's work. And um, yeah, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Jacob.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. These topic spotlights only open the conversation, while our Career Network group and aligned topic touchstone meetings aim to reinforce and reflect on the themes. As our community's voice, I am greatly aware that my voice, while relatable, must remain fueled by those I serve. That's what the World of Work ecosystem aims to do. Simply click the links to find out more. Thanks for listening.